I guess you could say I was just another Marine. Another cog in the machine stationed at the Marine Corps Air-Ground Combat Training Center, a sprawling desert base far removed from the usual comforts of civilian life. Most folks just call it the Combat Center, and if you've never been, picture miles of harsh, sun-baked terrain that serves as the backdrop for the grueling training that happens there. It's a place where stories of strange happenings are as common as the dust kicked up by our convoys, but until that night, I'd never paid much attention to those stories. It was early April, and the weather was perfect. Warm days with a cool breeze that made the desert nights bearable. I enjoyed these field ops more than most, partly because it was a break from the mundane routines of daily base life, and partly because out here, under the vast, starlit sky, you felt like you were part of something bigger than yourself. There's a kind of freedom in that isolation, a rare peace amidst the chaos of military life. That particular night, my buddy Jake and I were assigned to fire watch. We were kitted out with our full gear, plate carriers, helmets, rifles, and our night vision goggles, NVGs, mounted and ready. We each carried 4 mags of live ammo, standard issue for exercises like this, especially since an artillery battalion was conducting live-fire drills nearby. The distant boom of the guns and the subsequent thuds as the shells hit their marks echoed across the open desert, a reminder of the constant readiness we were expected to maintain. As the night deepened and the sporadic conversations dwindled to silence, I flipped down my NVGs to scan the perimeter. The green-tinged world that came into view was eerily calm. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure moving in the distance. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or a small desert animal, but then it moved again, more distinctly this time. I nudged Jake, nodding toward the spot. He flipped down his goggles and after a tense moment whispered, "Yeah, but what is it? Coyote?" "No, too big for a coyote. And it looks like it's walking on 2 legs, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He tapped my shoulder and pointed. "There's more than one man." Following his gesture, I saw several more figures darting around in the dark. They weren't particularly tall, maybe around 5 feet 5 inches, but their builds were muscular, with disproportionately large arms and legs that hinted at immense strength. Their skin appeared dark and tough, like leather, and their eyes were large and unblinking. They had no noses to speak of, just wide mouths filled with sharp teeth. "Dude, they're getting closer," Jake murmured, tension rising in his voice. I nodded, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. "I'm going to wake the corporal." As I sprinted to our sleeping officer, the night suddenly erupted in gunfire. Racing back, I saw Jake shooting into the dark where the creatures were now visibly closer, perhaps 300 yards away. As the rest of our unit was roused by the noise, our officer in charge, OIC, came running over. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, freezing when we pointed towards the advancing creatures. As he stared, disbelief etched across his face. More gunfire erupted from another unit involved in the night's exercises. When I looked back, the creatures had shifted positions, now sprinting towards us on all fours at an incredible speed. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and opened fire. The bullets hit, tearing chunks from the nearest creature, but it barely slowed. It was terrifyingly clear our standard weapons were almost useless. "Get to the trucks. Move!" the OIC yelled, his command snapping us out of our shock. Jake and I ran for our vehicle, a 7-ton truck parked nearby. I flipped the battery switch as Jake fired up the engine. Just as we started to pull away, I glanced out the window in time to see one of the creatures catch up to a Marine who hadn't made it to any vehicle. The creature tore him apart with a gruesome efficiency, and my stomach churned at the sight. We didn't stop. As we drove, I saw another Humvee attacked. The gunner tried to defend himself but was overwhelmed in seconds. The creatures were merciless, pulling the driver out through the shattered front glass before disappearing into the desert night with his body. By the time we reached the main road, the night sky was alive with the sound of helicopters and the sweeping beams of searchlights. It seemed the base had finally realized something was terribly wrong. At the checkpoint, men in black uniforms and ski masks, unmarked and chilling in their anonymity, stopped us. They knew things about us, personal details they couldn't possibly know. After a chilling threat to our safety should we ever speak of this night, they dismissed the incident as a routine mishap. A story we knew was as far from the truth as could be. I left the service about a year later, but that night never left me. It haunts my dreams, a constant reminder of the unknown dangers lurking in the shadows of the very grounds meant to prepare us for war. Life after that night at the combat center was never quite the same. I transitioned back into routine duties, but the shadow of what had happened hung over me like a shroud. I could see it in the eyes of those who were there with us, a silent acknowledgement of the horror we'd witnessed, an understanding that some secrets were too dark, too dangerous to ever be shared openly. We all carried it, a weight that sometimes bowed us, bending but not breaking. Despite the warning given to us by those mysterious men in black, curiosity gnawed at me. I started poking around, trying to gather whatever scraps of information I could without raising suspicion. It was a dangerous game, but I needed to understand, to find some semblance of truth amid the layers of cover-ups and threats. Most turned away, too fearful of the consequences, but a few whispered of similar occurrences, of strange entities sighted in other secluded military zones across the country. None of us knew what to make of it. Were these experiments gone awry, or something far more ancient and undiscovered? Months turned into a year, and the base felt increasingly suffocating. I put in for a transfer, hoping a change of scenery would help me escape the memories, but the bureaucracy moved slowly. Meanwhile, I tried to focus on the good friends, the rare calls home, the simple pleasure of a cold beer on a hot day. But at night, when the desert cooled and the stars blazed overhead, the memories would return, vivid and terrifying. Finally, my transfer came through, and I found myself stationed at a base on the East Coast. It was a different world, lush and green, a stark contrast to the barren expanses of the desert. But peace was still elusive. I started having nightmares, vivid reenactments of that night, waking up in cold sweats with the echo of those creatures' shrieks in my ears. I sought help, talked to a therapist on base who was sympathetic, but clearly out of her depth. She suggested PTSD, prescribed some meds to help me sleep, but nothing stopped the dreams, the feeling of being watched, the sense that those creatures were still out there, biding their time. Then, one evening, I was contacted by someone who'd been at the combat center with us, a guy named Martinez who'd been a few trucks back during the escape. He'd heard from others that I was asking questions and had his own story to share. We met discreetly at a quiet bar off base, where he told me about encounters in other locations, sightings of creatures not unlike what we'd seen, covered up just as quickly. Martinez had a theory that these beings were not unknown to certain higher-ups in the military, that they might even be the result of some clandestine biological or genetic experimentation, possibly connected to national defense. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but after what I'd seen, nothing seemed too far-fetched. Our conversation was cut short when Martinez suddenly went quiet, his eyes flicking to the door. He muttered a quick goodbye and left abruptly. I tried to contact him after that night, but his phone was disconnected, and no one at his last known unit could tell me where he'd gone. It was as if he'd vanished, which only deepened my unease. As time passed, my desire to uncover the truth became an obsession. I started reaching out more broadly, finding others with similar experiences, piecing together a patchwork of evidence that suggested something much bigger, much more sinister than any of us had realized. But with every step closer to the truth, the danger seemed to grow. I received anonymous threats, cryptic warnings to stop digging, to let it go. But I couldn't let it go. I wouldn't. I owed it to those who hadn't made it back that night, to those who might still face these horrors unaware of what awaited them. I began documenting everything, keeping records hidden away, planning to expose the truth when the time was right. Then one night, it all came crashing down. My apartment was broken into, my files rifled through, though nothing seemed to be stolen. The message was clear: back off. Shaken but undeterred, I moved my efforts further underground, connecting with others who were also determined to bring this to light. Now, years later, I live with a constant glance over my shoulder, a readiness that comes from knowing too much. But I also live with a hope that someday we can expose whatever darkness is being harbored, confront whatever threats lurk in the shadows, and ensure no one else has to endure the nightmares we've faced. Until then, I keep watching, keep searching for that elusive piece of evidence that will finally bring everything into the light. It's a lonely road, but necessary. For truth, for justice, for those we lost in the desert night. They say that kids are more attuned to the supernatural realm. I've always been skeptical about that idea, but there's one experience from my childhood that I can't quite shake off, no matter how hard I try. It's a recurring nightmare that has followed me throughout my life, haunting me with its vividness and the eerie sense of reality it carried. Get comfortable, because this is a tale that's a bit longer and far more unsettling than your average bedtime story. This particular nightmare always started the same way. It was night, and I found myself outside my family home. That in itself was strange because we lived by a firm rule. When the streetlights come on, it's time to come in. If you didn't, well, grounding was the least of your worries. Yet, there I was, outside, breaking the golden rule of my childhood without understanding why. I remember looking through the window of our house. The lights inside were warm and inviting, casting a soft glow that contrasted sharply with the growing darkness around me. I could see my family gathered around the dinner table, plates filled with food, laughter echoing faintly through the glass. They seemed utterly oblivious to my absence, which was odd and disheartening. I banged on the window, my hands making thudding sounds that should have been impossible to ignore. Yet, there was no reaction. No one glanced up. It was as if I was invisible, a ghost stranded outside my own life. Feeling a mix of confusion and rising panic, I turned away from the window, and that's when I saw it. A swing set in the driveway, appearing as if from nowhere. My best friend Kyle was there, swinging back and forth. The sight of him should have been a relief, but something was off. Kyle swung in silence, his face devoid of expression, ignoring my calls and the uneasy atmosphere. Desperate for some interaction, some sign that I wasn't alone in this bizarre night, I sat down on the swing next to him. The metal chains creaked under my weight, a sound eerily loud in the quiet of the evening. Kyle. I tried again, but he was like a statue, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Then, I remembered the candy stash I had hidden in the backyard. Starbursts, our favorite. Surely, that would get his attention. Hold on, I'll get us a surprise. I shouted over to him, more to comfort myself than in hope he would reply. I dashed to the backyard, rummaging through the old, hollowed-out log where I hid the sweets. My fingers found the wrappers, and clutching the candy, I raced back, buoyed by the thought of sharing them with Kyle. But as I neared the driveway, my heart sank. The swing was empty, still swaying slightly as if mocking my return. Kyle was gone. The neighborhood seemed darker now, each house locked up tight and shadowed. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned back towards the street, only to watch in horror as each set of streetlights flickered and went out, one by one, the darkness creeping towards me with a palpable malevolence. Panic surged through me as I ran to the front door, frantically ringing the doorbell, pounding on it with my fists. Behind me, the darkness advanced, swallowing everything in its path. I felt it then, a presence, something ancient and evil, lurking within that encroaching shadow. It was the same demonic presence that whispered threats in my dreams, its voice a chilling blend of malice and glee. As the last streetlight flickered out, the darkness reached me. The world went silent but for the sound of demonic laughter, filling the air as the night swallowed me whole. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for an impact, an end, and then I woke up. The nightmare ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me drenched in sweat, heart pounding in the silence of my real bedroom. I never had that particular nightmare again, but its effects lingered. Ever since that day, I've been inexplicably drawn to dark, macabre things, and bouts of crippling depression ambush me with no warning. Was it just a dream? It felt as real as any memory. The fear, the confusion, the sense of utter isolation. How can a mere dream capture such emotions with devastating accuracy? Now, I can't help but wonder, what's your worst nightmare? Have you ever felt a dream so deeply that it seemed to cross over, blurring the lines between the realms of sleep and waking life? As I grew older, the vividness of that nightmare never really faded. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of my vision, a constant reminder of that surreal and terrifying experience. The line between reality and the realm of dreams had been blurred on that fateful night, and though years had passed, the echoes of those demonic laughs still haunted the darker corners of my mind. Life moved on, as it always does, and I tried to bury the memory deep within, locking it away in hopes it would fade with time. I went to college, moved to a different city, and started a new chapter in my life. But the more I tried to forget, the more vividly the details returned to me in quiet moments. When I gazed out of my apartment window into the night, or when the city's lights flickered momentarily. During my junior year, I took a psychology class that covered the basics of dream interpretation and the effects of traumatic experiences on sleep patterns. This class sparked a curiosity in me that I hadn't realized was there. Could there be an explanation for what I experienced? Was it merely a child's response to fear and the unknown, or something deeper, perhaps even paranormal? Driven by a need for answers, I began to delve into research on dreams and nightmares. I learned about the concept of night terrors and how they differ from nightmares. More intense, more vivid, and seemingly more real. The pieces slowly began to fit together, but they formed a picture that was as unsettling as the dream itself. As part of my exploration, I reached out to others who had experienced similar fears. Online forums and support groups introduced me to a world where my experiences were not unique. People from all walks of life shared their own chilling tales of nightmares that had followed them into their waking lives. Each story was different in its content, but the underlying theme was the same: a sense of an otherworldly presence that left a lasting impact long after the dream had ended. I decided to visit my childhood home during one winter break. The house was mostly as I remembered it, but it felt smaller, less intimidating, and the mystical fear that once permeated my dreams seemed silly in the light of day. Yet, as night approached, an uneasy feeling settled over me. I found myself involuntarily glancing towards the window where I had once seen my family sitting at the dinner table, oblivious to my plight. Compelled by a mixture of fear and nostalgia, I ventured into the attic, the source of many sinister dreams from my childhood. The air was thick with dust and memories. As I sifted through old boxes and family memorabilia, a chill ran through me, not from the cold, but from a flicker of recognition. There, in the far corner of the attic, was the old, beaten-up trunk that had appeared in countless dreams, sometimes as a benign storage container, other times as a sinister hiding place for unseen horrors. With a mixture of trepidation and resolve, I opened the trunk. Inside, among various old clothes and forgotten toys, was a book on the supernatural that had belonged to my grandfather. Its pages were yellowed with age, the spine cracked from use. I remembered seeing him read it by the firelight, a look of intense concentration on his face. I had never known what drew him to such topics. Was it merely curiosity, or had he experienced his own unexplainable events? That night, back in my old room, I began to read. The book covered a range of topics from folklore to psychic phenomena. It posited that some people are more susceptible to supernatural experiences, either due to environmental factors or personal sensitivity. I read about places where the veil between worlds was thin, where the spirits of the past were not just memories but real presences. Sleep was elusive that night. Each creak and whisper of the house seemed amplified, and though I told myself it was just the settling of an old building, the child within me feared the dark corners just as much as I had years ago. The nightmares didn't return that night, or any night since, but the sensation of being watched, of something just out of sight, was as strong as ever. As I continued my studies and discussions with others, I realized that some questions might never be fully answered. Perhaps some doors, once opened, are not meant to be closed. My experiences, both dream and reality, had shaped me in ways I could not have anticipated. They drove me to explore, to seek understanding, and to connect with others who had walked similar paths. Now, I share my story not just as a tale of childhood fears, but as an invitation to look deeper into the experiences that shape us. What are the shadows that linger in your life? How do they influence your path, your decisions, your beliefs? Whether you believe in the supernatural or see it as a metaphor for our inner fears, the impact is undeniably real. As for me, I continue to explore the thin line between dream and reality, always aware that the next discovery could be just around the corner, waiting in the shadows of the unknown.